Assaid. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to be continuing our tafsir that we are really, let's say, excited about. And certainly, let's just really quick before we do anything to go over some of the things that we had talked about this past, I guess, while. We're not going to go all the way far. Okay. So we actually went in details with this one. The last lecture, we went in details with what if the Jews had basically slaughtered based on their scripture, but certainly certain things they are not permitted to eat, at least within their legislation. Are we permitted to eat that or not? And we went in details with that, not necessarily just with the ruling, but we wanted to learn something very important in regards to understanding the ruling and how it basically has different interpretations in different madhab. So that's what we wanted to really focus on. And we talked about how the Malikis themselves had different views on regarding this ruling, and how these different opinions they basically may differ in one madhab. And then we talked about those evidences and how they're researched. All right, so those evidences, how they're researched, and how we talked about those evidences and how they would debate those evidences even within the same madhab. So we went in details with that one. We did talk about some scholars that were mentioned. We talked about Muhammad ibn Sahnun, and we also talked a little bit about Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim. Didn't really go in lots of details because we did talk about him previously, so didn't want to go in details with him. And we also talked about, let me see, any other scholar? We talked a little bit about Ibn al-Mundhir, and that was basically that ayah that we left off at. So we left off at وَإِنَّا لَصَادِقُونَ, which is this one. And we basically also connected between the legislation and التحريم. And we had mentioned that part of the different ways for discipline, and this is extremely important, that one of the different ways for discipline is basically using the form of mana, or prevention. Okay, or using something that you take away from the person as a way to basically discipline the person. So whether this is in parenting, or whether this is also in, perhaps, if you like a sheikh or a sheikha, they're helping mentor somebody, for example, maybe grow in their deen, and then they would use this method of probably taking away their phone from them for a week, for example, or maybe taking away their laptop, or maybe perhaps taking away or asking them that, they need to give up on sugar, whatever it is. Okay. Let's say you as a mentor, let's call it a religious therapist. Maybe we should have that. Okay. So that would be that sheikh, which is a religious therapist. Okay, think of it as that mentor in that way, and they can use al-mana'. There are different methods, by the way. The Sufis, especially the Sufis, I think they do an outstanding job. We did go in certain things about Sufis. Sometimes the Sufi sheikh may use certain things that they would obligate you with. They will tell you, I want you to do 1,000 times a salat ala nabi, for example, as a form of punishment, or as a form of discipline, or as a form of helping you go up that ladder of your deen. So they'll probably ask you, here's what I want you to do. Other forms of tarbiyah may be through al-mana', through disciplining you by taking something away. Perhaps maybe taking away, like I said, phone, maybe something, okay, to help you focus. Another form of discipline is reducing the amount of money, reducing the amount of food, reducing the amount of comfort. So they might ask you to sleep, instead of sleeping on your bed, perhaps sleep on a very thin mattress for a week, or perhaps don't turn on the AC and sleep in a warm weather to basically wake you up at night because you're not comfortable. And that will probably provoke you to wake up at the middle of the night and perhaps do your qiyam al-layl. Turn off the AC, and I want you to only turn it on when you are doing qiyam al-layl, and that way you would be super hot, and then perhaps only turn on the AC to make you at least get cooled down again, and that will probably help you get into that discipline. These are just some of the examples. And the way that they had learned this, it is plain anecdotal. You know, one thing that certain groups did not understand is that they thought that when these shuyukh would recommend or use these forms of discipline, that they were attributing it to sunnah, and then that's why they came out with the wrong description, calling it a bid'ah. I would say they misunderstood this tarbiyah as if it was a sunnah in a religious recommendation. And that's where I would say that that dispute had gone wrong, because they didn't say that it was a sunnah per se. They were using the different things that they had learned from the Quran and from the sunnah, and making those paradigms to help them see as different tips and different methods to help basically the person grow in their deen, or perhaps grow in their discipline, and based on that to basically learn how to improve in their deen and so forth. So just putting that within that perspective, seeing this as one of the evidence that they would use. ذَلِكَ جَزَيْنَاهُمْ بِبَغْيِهِمْ. And then they considered that, okay, does it have to be necessarily something within the scripture that we have to abide by in order to use as a form of discipline? Or can it be something else? Can it be something that perhaps a recommendation, or anecdotally, just that shaykh, and with his experience, that if I were to use 1, 2, 3 methods, that might provoke 1, 2, 3 outcomes, or that might improve in 1, 2, 3 outcomes. So for the Sufis, at least in certain tariqas, not all, but they will say, well, we've got the evidence that we could use, that ذَلِكَ جَزَيْنَاهُمْ بِبَغْيِهِمْ, and they said, well, haramna does not necessarily mean that that was what the scripture was saying, but it can be that it was a recommendation through their shuyukh or through their rabbis. They didn't have shuyukh, but it was like their rabbis. Okay, so was that the rabbis and what they had derived from the text possibly, or was it something that was in the text itself? It could be both, because even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned that that Israel, and that was ما حرم إسرائيل على نفسه. They said, well, Israel, that is Yaqub alayhi salam, and that's what he had regarded as something as that is haram upon himself. But then, of course, the debate goes, well, he's a prophet. He's actually part of those resources that have the right to legislate. So then you would see this debate and where it's going, but I wanted you to see ذَلِكَ جَزَيْنَاهُمْ بِبَغْيِهِمْ, and does that give the sheikh or a sheikh who's acting as a mentor the right, or at least his experience, to mentor the students in certain ways by using prevention, by using recommendation, and telling you, I want you to do as because you had admitted that you came to me and you had admitted, yes, they will use this confession type of thing to help the sheikh basically discipline the student. They call him the murid, and the student will come and say, well, here's what I committed this week. This is what I did. I went online, I talked to a girl or whatever it is, and this is what I had done. I, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. So then the sheikh might actually say, you know what? I need to take your phone away from you. I need you to get me the laptop. I need you to get me this, where you're going to be basically grounded from using this for a whole month to wean you off this fitna, for example. Or perhaps maybe change the passwords for everything and basically not have the password until the sheikh until the sheikh basically is informed and goes probably to the sheikh to give him the password and use whatever is needed in front of the sheikh. Why? As a way of discipline, as a way of mentoring this student. Okay, so like I said, this ta'deeb or this mentorship is inspired by such ayat or such a hadith, and this is what they consider, that we can get the inspiration as a method for tarbiyah from this. What do I consider? I see that, yes, the Sufis are really good at this type of discipline, and we had seen such tarbiyah have not only the effect during their era, but I would say the effect in many centuries, throughout many centuries. This type of shuyukh mentorship was definitely probably the most effective in our societies throughout history. There is no really question that they had managed to not only discipline during the time of that, let's say, murid, but they managed to discipline generations and generations and definitely have the greatest outcome. So speaking of that, وَإِنَّا لَصَادِقُونَ then, إِنَّا لَصَادِقُونَ, of course, this was basically explained last time. So let's go on with the other page. But before we do the other page, we are going to do exactly the same way every time we come across a new page. We pretty much give a whole general translation, and then we go in thorough translation based on Tafseer al-Qurtubi. So let's see here. فَإِن كَذَّبُوكَ, if they deny you, فَقُلْ رَبُّكُمْ ذُو رَحْمَةٍ وَاسِعَةٍ. If they deny you, then say, your Lord is magnificent. ذُو رَحْمَةٍ. I want to look at the word ذُو, because the word ذُو basically means the one that owns something. So ذُو رَحْمَةٍ وَاسِعَةٍ, that he is basically the owner of mercy. Mercy basically all belongs to the Lord Almighty, and that's why he said ذُو رَحْمَةٍ وَاسِعَةٍ. He's great in his mercy, and certainly it is vast. وَلَا يُرَدُّ بَأْسُهُ عَنِ الْقَوْمِ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. And no one, وَلَا يُرَدُّ, and no one can. The word yurad can mean to return, and can mean to reject, and can also mean to stop. Okay, to reject, to stop, all of that, or even to obstruct. All right, and the word ba'suhu, his power. So فَإِن كَذَّبُوكَ, if they deny you, then tell them, even though, the first thing that you would think of is that if they deny you, then tell them there's going to be a punishment as a consequence. But that's not what it said. فَإِن كَذَّبُوكَ فَقُلْ رَبُّكُمْ ذُو رَحْمَةٍ وَاسِعَةٍ. Then say, your Lord's mercy is vast, and yet no one is capable of obstructing his power, his might, away from the people of crime. Now I want you to look at this one. He didn't say this, لا يرد بأسه عن القوم المجرمين, and then ربكم ذو رحمة واسعة, but he actually said the mercy first as an invitation. This reminds me of the hadith when Sayyidah Aisha had said that the Prophet ﷺ ما خير بين أمرين إلا اختار أيسرهما. Every time the Prophet ﷺ was given the option of two things, he would choose whatever is easier. The other thing is that the Prophet ﷺ, فَقُلْ رَبُّكُمْ ذُو رَحْمَةٍ وَاسِعَةٍ, the Prophet ﷺ had said in, as you know, an inspiration and part of that, he basically said, يَسِّرُوا وَلَا تُعَسِّرُوا بَشِّرُوا وَلَا تُنَفِّرُوا يَسِّرُوا وَلَا تُعَسِّرُوا. Make things easy and don't make it hard. بَشِّرُوا وَلَا تُنَفِّرُوا. Even though we would say what would be an antonym to the word bashiru is bashiru. What does bashiru mean anyways? So bashiru means to bring glad tidings. You know, you're encouraging somebody, you're telling them of a future or at least a good optimistic hope. Okay, so this is a hope. And not only are you hopeful, but you're really optimistic of the consequence. So bashiru, bring that bushra, that glad tidings. Okay. وَلَا تُنَفِّرُوا, and don't let people repel away from the da'wah itself. bashiru ولا تعسروا, or يسروا ولا تعسروا, bashiru ولا تنفروا. So how do we do that tanfir? Sometimes it depends on the person. Remember the question that I was asked yesterday? How do you know the limit to probably having a nice sense of humor or probably a certain level of being humble, etc.? I said, well, it depends on the person that's in front of you. That's the limit. The limit is going to be determined by the person that is in front of you sometimes. And that's the same thing. التبشير والتنفير is going to be determined by the person that is in front of you. If this person is new to the religion, then you have to basically use that data and that piece of information that you know about that person. And in order to mentor them, you need to keep in mind that they're new to the religion. So therefore, the orders, the da'wah recommendations, the tips on the religion, you have to look at the circumstance and the level that they're in right now. So if this woman, let's say a new Muslim, definitely you don't want to discuss hijab right now. If she's ready for it, by all means, that's okay. That's great. Good job. But you don't want to discuss that right now, usually. Okay. If she's new to the religion, you don't want to discuss dietary things, perhaps before discussing things on perhaps major sins. We're talking about zina, we're talking about khamr, alcohol, we're talking about those major sins up there. That's what you would want to discuss, because those items are, even though they are hard on new Muslims, but they are within the scope that there's no question about. Okay, and therefore, ما أتيتكم به ما أمرتكم به فأتوا منه ما استطعتم وما نهيتكم عنه فانتهوا. And what I ordered you to abstain from, you're going to abstain from it right away. So if we're talking about major sins, then that's one thing that you want to probably work on that with that Muslim. But let's say they've got different things that they are addicted to. So then we're going to, it's okay, we can use this type of withdrawal with them until they do a complete withdrawal. بشروا ولا تنفروا يسروا ولا تعسروا. So we would basically have to learn this method. And that's why when we deal, for example, with the people in prisons that have a history of crime, definitely the method of da'wah is going to be completely different than perhaps doing da'wah with probably an academic professor, maybe because their understanding and even the lifestyle that they had lived to get this far is completely different. It's completely different. And certainly most of the times they're definitely going to be cleaner. They're going to be a lot more, I guess, within the area of discipline. So it's going to be a lot easier to work with somebody that was probably a professor, then converted to Islam, than somebody that had a history of crime, a history of probably hanging out with the wrong people. Then they're definitely going to need a different kind of a discipline. So when you look at here, فَإِن كَذَّبُوكَ, now this was actually relating to the major sin, which is shirk right there. If they deny you, then say, I want you to look at this, فَقُلْ, because the fa basically means that this is bidun tarahi, that there's no time lapse, but right away, this would be your first response. The first response that I want you to give is tell them that their Lord Almighty is the one that is vast in his mercy. In other words, the first thing that you want to congratulate in case that they would accept and embrace that da'wah is that they will be finding rahmah. They will be finding mercy. In other words, it's a solution to a lot of the problems in their life. It will come and bring about not only the solutions, but ease in their life. It will bring about the mercy, meaning in this life, where it is the opposite of curse. Okay, so if you say mercy, what's the opposite of mercy? It's curse. What is curse in comparison to mercy? Well, it's basically one, your dua is not answered when you're probably praying for help, you're probably putting efforts, but then the outcomes are not coming as you had expected, or things are just going wrong in your life, or probably khawf, living in fear, or probably living in stresses, basically as khawf and huzun. Okay, so now you're seeing those are as a result of curse. So dying, for example, in suicide is basically a sign that this person had gone really far in that fitna that they were living in, and that resulted in losing hope. And that's that severity of it, losing hope in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which basically resulted in that curse, that they had lost any hope in the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they basically took away their own life. So that's in terms of nafs. In terms of aql, of course, what would lead to the curse is khamr, and khamr is al khaba'ith. So if the person is engaging in, for perhaps drug dealing or drug consumption or using any of that, or even alcohol, etc., then this person is susceptible to getting cursed as for using that. Same thing if we're looking at al-ird, we're talking about zina. This person is susceptible, if they are on the path of engaging in zina with its different forms, whether it's virtual, meaning we're talking about right now pornography, or even if it's in person, engaging in zina, that would basically be as what leads to curse. What leads to curse, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it clear, don't even get near. Why? Because this will lead to curse. All right? وَمَا يَفْعَلْ ذَلِكَ يَلْقَى أَثَامًا يُضَاعَفْ لَهُ الْعَذَابُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ وَيَخْلُدْ فِيهِ مُهَانًا. All right? So let's continue, of course, when we're speaking about same thing. If we're talking about ird, then we're talking about money. Okay, finally, because we're doing DNAIM. If we're talking about money, engaging in riba leads to curse. So you could see right there that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically saying, فَإِن كَذَّبُوكَ, if they were to deny you, فَقُلْ رَبُّكُمْ, then say your Lord is ذُو رَحْمَةٍ وَاسِعَةٍ. He is basically vast in his mercy. And when you say ذُو رَحْمَةٍ وَاسِعَةٍ, what is al-wasi'? Al-wasi' is one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But here, wasi'atin is a description to the rahmah, okay? That was not, when you talk about the 99 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, some of those names are basically adjectives, and some of them are nouns. or right. Some of them are adjectives and others are nouns. So the ones that are nouns, those would be al-ism. And the ones that are adjectives would be derived from a certain action. So when you look at, for example, al-Qahhar, is that his name or is that a description of his action? That he is al-Qahhar, that he is al-Razzaq. Is that a name or is that he gives rizq, therefore he is the provision giver, the provider, okay? So now we look at some of the names are describing an action and other names are describing or are basically a noun on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-awwal, al-akhir, that's a name, that's a name. Allah, that's a name, all right? Yet, when you look at فَقُلْ رَبُّكُمْ ذُو رَحْمَةٍ وَاسِعَةٍ, the word wasi'ah is a description to the rahmah. Okay, so what does that even look like in terms of practice, in terms of at least application? ذُو رَحْمَةٍ wasi'ah, it will include dunya and include akhirah. It will include the rahmah in this life and the rahmah in the hereafter. It will include a mercy in your health, a mercy in your wealth, a mercy in your children, a mercy in probably your the different stations in your life. So when you look at wasi'ah, that's basically indicating inclusivity in where the Lord Almighty's mercy will fall if the person embraces Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's one. Number one is tawheed. Number two is legislation. How did we get to legislation? So we got to legislation within the context. Because remember, the page before it, the context was actually talking about the different legislations. And since it was talking about the different legislations, of course, did they necessarily deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, if you deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you're going to find yourself denying all the details that basically come with embracing basically the legislation and with embracing Islam itself. You're going to find yourself within that corner. So if a person embraced La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah, then that would mean you had considered that Islam is your foundation, that Islam is your main resource, and therefore everything that Muhammad ibn Abdullah had come with in terms of legislation, you consider it as coming and tracing all the way to the Lord Almighty, because you had just embraced that Muhammad ibn Abdullah was a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whether this was talking about siwak being sunnah to use, or whether this is talking about jihad being in order to basically engage in. So whether on a big scale or whether on a small thing in our life, so then therefore ذو رحمة واسعة is to include both. ذو رحمة واسعة, whether in terms of your embracement to Tawheed, or whether the embracement to the legislature itself that will include the person within this rahmah if they were to abide by two. To abide by, فَإِن كَذَّبُوكَ is telling us كَذَّبُوكَ, whether in Tawheed or whether كَذَّبُوكَ in legislature. Whether they had denied you in Tawheed or whether they had denied you in the legislation that you had basically just explained to them. What did he explain? Well, right there in that ayah, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِي مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا. Okay, so I need to just, okay, I'm gonna need to end it right here, okay? So وَلَا يُرَدُ بَأْسُهُ عَنِ الْقَوْمِ الْمُجْرِمِينَ, I would hate to stop right here, but I'm gonna continue just this portion of it, just because I just got an urgent thing. سَيَقُولُ الَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا لَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ مَا أَشْرَكْنَا وَلَا آبَاؤُنَا وَلَا حَرَّمْنَا مِنْ شَيْءٍ. Those that would associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would basically make the claim, if the Lord Almighty would have wanted us not to associate partners with with him, or even our forefathers, or even would not. وَلَا حَرَّمْنَا مِنْ شَيْءٍ. Now, this is why when we said كَذَّبُوك is involving two areas. Number one is involving tawheed, and number two is involving legislature, because the following ayah right there, مَا أَشْرَكْنَا وَلَا آبَاؤُنَا وَلَا حَرَّمْنَا مِنْ شَيْءٍ. Now, this is to let us know that when he said فَإِنْ كَذَّبُوك, this is involving two areas. And that's what they even understood. They even understood that. And that's why they said, of course, those that have associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they said, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had willed, we would have not associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not us and not our ancestors, and we would not have وَلَا حَرَّمْنَا مِنْ شَيْءٍ, or we would have not prohibited anything. In other words, legislated on our own. So what did they want to do? Well, they wanted to claim that by not having an intervention or a direct intervention at the time, which they wanted to basically claim there was no divine intervention, there was no divine objection to our way of life, then therefore it should be acceptable. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَذَلِكَ كَذَّبَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. In other words, the nations before, they made the similar claim. In other words, what is the inference? The inference is that the nations before, the generations before, they did get other prophets, but they made the exact same objection or the same exact claim that, hey, if God wanted us to not prohibit these things or not make our own legislature or not believe in other gods, then there would be a divine intervention. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, the nations before, they said and made the same claim, even though the prophets were there sent to them to tell them, well, listen, your way of life, here's a divine resource to tell you your way of life in basically legislation, and your way of life in creed is basically going against the Lord Almighty. So then the ayah continues, قُلْ هَلْ عِنْدَكُمْ مِنْ عِلْمٍ فَتُخْرِجُوهُ لَنَا. Tell them, do you have any, basically the word min ilm, this isn't talking about any science, but this is actually talking about a resource. What is the resource that you depended on, that you had considered that here's my evidence to prove that this was divine, basically, that this is divine? Whether we're speaking about the way that they were believing in other gods or whether they were talking about legislation. So the ayah is saying, well, where's your resource? Where's the resource that you depended on, that in order for us to really scrutinize your resource and show you the discrepancies, show you basically the conflicting evidences right there that you are basically depending on, and then are you able to bring it? إِن تَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. Now, of course, the ayah already knows, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that they don't have any evidence because they basically did not depend on a divine resource. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically then brings it to them and says, إِن تَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ وَإِن أَنْتُمْ إِلَّا تَخْرُصُونَ. All that you're following is really nothing but that speculation. You're depending on speculation, not a valid resource. It's just your own thoughts, basically making all of this up. And then all that you're doing is nothing but takhrusun. This is just mere lies or mere blasphemy. Takhrusun. But I'm going to talk in details about the word takhrusun because there's, I think I talked about it before, but it's really important to talk about it, inshallah, in details. قُلْ فَلِلَّهِ الْحُجَّةُ الْبَالِغَةُ. So what is the alternative to all of this? Said قُلْ, and I want to comment on the word قُلْ because coming in with great confidence, say, for the Lord Almighty is al-hujjatu al-baligha. What is al-hujjah? Al-hujjah is consider it as the grand evidence, as the ultimate evidence. Al-baligha, that it basically had reached them, that it basically transcended their time and transcended even their place. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's evidence and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words basically contain the ultimate evidence that has no question, not a shred. And that word shred right there comes from denying or objecting to the word takhrusun. We're going to see where that shred comes in with. Okay, not a shred of a discrepancy or a shred of fault or a shred of containing any type of contradictions. فَلَوْ شَاءَ لَهَدَاكُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. But at the end, if the Lord Almighty would have wanted, He would have given all of them basically al-huda, guidance. In other words, what? In other words, it's not an evidence to prove or to disprove by saying, well, if He would have wanted us, He would have forced us. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you the free will to choose or to deny because you're being tested. It makes no sense if you're being tested that you're going to be forced to accept and basically forced to obey. Then there would be no test. But the Lord Almighty is saying, well, فَلَوْ شَاءَ لَهَدَاكُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. That's in the context of letting you know that the evidence is there, but you have to let your free will submit to the Lord Almighty and submit to the evidence. Otherwise, you're going to be living with that discrepancy yourself, and then thinking that you can blame it on Allah Almighty, and when in reality, it's your free will that chose not to believe. Here's what I'm going to do. I need to end right there for a sudden something that popped up. So what we're going to do, I'm going to stop right there, but inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. I was really hoping, I was really hoping to continue even farther than that, but subhanAllah, something just came up and we'll continue tomorrow, inshallah. Sorry for not even taking questions, but I definitely need to see the names that are joining in. I need to keep track of who's here.